Good morning, students. This is Mr. Herring. This is your final exam review video for philosophy. Just so we're all clear on the format of this video, I'm going to be working through the review vocabulary packet systematically. There are 100 terms. I'm going to introduce each one by its number. So please, if you don't need to watch this whole video, please don't, because I'm confident it will be pretty long. So let's start at the beginning. We're going to talk about philosophy. So term one is philosophy. Philosophy can be defined in many ways, but I want to mention two briefly. Those are philosophy as the love of wisdom, going etymologically with this word from philos and sophia. A philosopher under that definition is one who has fallen in love with wisdom and with the search for wisdom. That's the way that philosophy is primarily used in antiquity. And in modernity, it acquires a lot of different meanings, just two of which I'll also mention. I've urged in class, I think it's best for us to think of philosophy as a rigorous system of thought seeking to account for reality. The trick with that definition is that it's rather flexible. If you run into new evidence that can change your view of philosophy or change your understanding of reality, your philosophy can shift and grow. Now, it's also worth mentioning that there is an academic discipline of philosophy that is really distinct from either of the two definitions I just mentioned. Where here, this academic discipline of philosophy is really trying to articulate the highest levels of abstract thought. And it gets very, very confusing very quickly. Well, term number two is ethics. Term two is ethics. Now, ethics here is looking at a system of determining what is right and what is wrong. Now, over the course of the year, we've looked at several different ethical systems and different thoughts that our different philosophers have in terms of ethics, whether we have Aristotle's virtue ethics or Kierkegaard's existentialist formative ethics, or whether we're thinking about John Stuart Mill's utilitarian ethics or Nietzsche's amoral relativistic ethics, or whether we're considering C.S. Lewis and his natural law ethics, or perhaps we're considering Immanuel Kant and his logical ethic, his deontological ethics. There's a lot of different ethical systems, and it is one of the glories and one of the despairs of philosophy that we often can't really come to complete agreement. Where we can find agreement is in the search for living the right way, and that living ethically has something to do with human flourishing. Let's move on to a set of 5 philosophical vocabulary terms. Each of these has to do with a kind of philosophy that we covered this year. So term number 3 is metaphysics. That's metaphysics. That literally translates to after physics. Physics, in this sense, is referring to the physical realm. Metaphysics is looking at what is beyond the physical. Metaphysics is philosophical reasoning that is concerned with what is beyond what is physically touchable and knowable. These would include philosophical reasonings about heaven, hell, the afterlife, and so on, as well as a variety of other kinds of thinkings about what reality has to be. Well, let's then turn to term 4, and that is ontology. Term 4 is looking at a philosophy of being. What does it mean to exist? What does it mean for a person to be? What does it mean for him to change modes of being? All of those are questions of ontology, a philosophy of being. Term 5 is epistemology. Here we're dealing with a philosophy of knowledge. Epistemology has everything to do with the fact that we know lots of things, but often we don't pause to consider why we know what we think we know. Or do we even know it with certainty, or do we know it with some level of uncertainty? Those are classic questions of epistemology. Term 6 is aesthetics, where aesthetics here refers to a philosophy of beauty. Aesthetics is looking at the question of what makes something beautiful. Is objective beauty, or is beauty subjective or objective? Is beauty in the eye of the beholder, or is beauty something we can all agree on? Term 7 is teleology, or teleology is referring to a philosophy of purpose. This was first articulated by Aristotle, and he argued that if we can understand a thing's purpose, we can then understand its essence. So the purpose then becomes the driving factor of what we need to figure out when we're trying to understand something. Now, it's worth pointing out that contemporary philosophy does not hold to teleology as a valid mode of philosophy today. The vast majority of contemporary philosophers are not theists. They are usually something else on the spectrum, and teleology ultimately finds it's a need for God because God is the ultimate author of purpose. Purpose can't be self-discovered, really, in teleology. Purpose is given by some higher being. So in the absence of God, teleology becomes a much less persuasive view of reality. Okay, well, let's move then to term 8, which is the first of our kind of history of philosophy terms, and that, of course, is the pre-Socratics. The pre-Socratics is a term that refers to all people raising philosophical questions before Socrates, but specifically a group of Greek thinkers who begin asking proto-scientific questions prior to Socrates. This is the generation right before Socrates, and these guys are making an early philosophical move in this sense. They reject the idea that the gods are the answer to everything. Why did the storm come in? Well, they don't believe that it's because Zeus was angry. Why did the sea rise? It's not because Poseidon threw a hissy fit. And now, I just want to be clear, that is as far as the pre-Socratics are correct. The pre-Socratics are really kind of fun to read, in part because we're often struck by just how wrong they are. The pre-Socratics, like most ancient Greeks, or most ancient Athenians particularly, the pre-Socratics were wealthy noblemen. For by and large, they had the leisure to sit around and think. Well, they believed that actually testing their theories was demeaning. So they didn't bother to actually try them out so much as just logically reason about them. And this was really their downfall. Now, I don't want to disparage the pre-Socratics too much because they certainly were vital to the beginnings of philosophy. And really, they are the place where we can trace back contemporary science to its earliest days. So, there's the pre-Socratics. At the same time as the pre-Socratics are running around, we also have term at number 9, which are the Sophists. The Sophists were a group of people they claim to have certain views on wisdom. You might notice the word Sophia is buried in Sophist. Well, Sophia is the Greek term for wisdom. The Sophists claim to have figured out a few things, and they will sell their wisdom to the student for a price. Particularly, the Sophists were selling rhetorical tricks, rhetorical methods of persuasion, so that people would obey whatever you wanted them to do. Now, the problem with the Sophists is that they did not adhere to anything actually being true. That's one thing if you have a gift of persuasion and you convince people to do what's right and good and what's true. In that case, I would argue, as would several folks from the Western tradition, that you've used your gift of persuasion rightly. But the Sophists believe that there is no such thing. There is just what helps you. So the Sophists were running around ancient Greece offering these things for sale, all kinds of rhetorical tricks. And then we've read a few of these guys because Plato takes them and uses them as conversation partners for Socrates. Which brings us to term number 10, the Platonic dialogue. The Platonic dialogue is our beginning point of a formal Western philosophy. In this sense, from the Platonic dialogue forward, philosophy is going to be conducted primarily as a written body of literature. This literature then is dialoguing across the centuries, but philosophy is ultimately going to be something people write down and read. Plato is the first one to actually do that. And he does it in this literary form, the dialogue, where you have one, 2, or 3, sometimes 4 conversation partners talking about a philosophical question. Well, so Plato has Socrates talk with various sophists about their different philosophical convictions, and the trouble here, and the only trick here, is that we may or may not know for sure that Socrates was a historical person. We know that Plato wrote him in the Republic. We know that Plato gives him all of these convictions. It's a little less sure whether or not those were Socrates' convictions or whether those are Plato's convictions. But regardless, in Plato's various works, Socrates asserts that there is truth, there is beauty, and there is goodness. And it is his job to try and show everyone that the sophists are either wrong or don't actually know anything. So, in looking at these Platonic dialogues, we ultimately have a struggle between a truth seeker, that's Socrates, and people who are trying to manipulate others for their own gain. Those are the sophists. And this is where formal Western philosophy really begins, in the quest for truth. So, now, in Plato's dialogues, Plato begins asking several questions. And these questions then become sort of the core of what Western philosophy is concerned with. Now, the first of these is term 11, and that's happiness. Plato asserts, through Socrates' questions, that everybody wants happiness. Everyone wants to be happy. Well, when we press that any further and we ask what is the thing that everyone wants, it becomes really hard to actually explain. And Socrates doesn't really tell us what happiness is. He just does his Socratic thing, and every time a sophist says, oh, happiness means pleasure, Socrates disproves that. Or a sophist says, I'm happy when I'm rich. Well, Socrates disproves that. By the end of the dialogues, we know that happiness is not wealth, it's not anything ephemeral, it's not anything material. Happiness is something greater than all of those. But what exactly happiness is, we'll have to wait until we get to Aristotle. Or if you are making careful notes, you could go ahead and connect term 11 to term 22. We'll get to eudaimonia here in a few moments. Now, term 12 is justice. Justice, of course, is the question of what is right. What is right? What are right relationships between people? And what do I owe another person? You'll remember, hopefully, this was our major question that we read about in books 1 and 2 of the Republic. And Socrates and his friends are all trying to figure out what exactly justice is. And the question of justice in the Republic is going to eventually lead to a giant thought experiment. They're not going to be able to resolve this, but we do see several views of justice in the Republic. We have folks like Thrasymachus who make the argument that justice is nothing but the interest of the stronger, which is very similar to what the view Nietzsche is going to articulate several hundred years later. But of course, we've eventually got Socrates, who defines justice as wisdom and virtue walking hand in hand, and that in between those we've got several other definitions, all of which become the basis of their conversation. Now, the question of justice is still a highly relevant one today. If you're familiar with some of the social justice conversations taking place in our wider culture in 2018, this is really bringing back a lot of the questions that Plato began exploring 2,500 years ago. What is justice? What do I owe to my fellow friend, family member, countryman? Do I have a duty to their prosperity or not? These are questions of justice. Well, let's turn then to term 13, and that will finish page 1. That term, of course, is virtue. Virtue, I want to just give you a definition from James K.A. Smith, a contemporary philosopher. He defines virtue as a good habit. Now, virtues these are good habits. They're a little bit beyond good habits that lead to prosperity and stuff like that. These instead are good habits in a moral sense. These are good habits that really, as Lewis would say, the Tao shows us, really everybody agrees these are the habits necessary for flourishing and happiness. Well, these questions of virtue are going to then become part of the question of ethics. The ethical life is the virtuous life. Well, also, defining virtue becomes really important, and we've got to figure out what is virtue, and then term 14, what is vice? Well, virtue is a good habit. A vice is a particular bad habit. Usually these two are opposites, where virtues are your positive list and vices are your negative list. And these are and then so vices will be unethical actions. Defining what constitutes a vice then becomes a pretty critical task. Now, in term 15, we get the idea of Gyges' ring. Term 15, Gyges' ring, is an ethical experiment where one of Socrates' conversation partners asserts that people do not actually desire justice. The Gyges' ring is a story where a man named Gyges finds a ring which grants him invisibility. Now, when he can do actions without consequences or without gaining any renown, the question is, what will he do? Will he do good actions, perhaps bring food to a starving village, or bring about peace in a war-torn land? Well, turns out our storyteller is a bit more pessimistic about human nature, because Gyges gets this ring and uses it to seduce the queen and kill the king and take over and gain power. Well, arguing then, of course, that according to Gyges' ring, the Gyges' ring scenario, people desire power above all else. They don't actually want justice. They don't actually want these virtues Socrates has been talking about. Instead, they want power. Well, we should also talk about term 16, and I'll just refer you back to some of the diagrams I drew on the whiteboard in class to help illustrate this. But term 16 is the theory of forms. This is Plato's understanding of epistemology, and it pairs very neatly with term 17, the transmigration of the soul. You see, Plato believed that there are two different levels to reality. There's the seen and the unseen. There is the material world, and there is the world of the ideas. The material world for Plato is inferior to the world of ideas. The world of ideas is where perfection lies. And everything that we see in the material world is nothing but a copy of the perfect version of itself that is located in the world of ideas. And if you can imagine a string going upwards from something into the sky, that's sort of what Plato is envisioning here. That my coffee mug here is an imperfect coffee mug, but I recognize that it is a coffee mug because it participates in the form of coffee mug, in the ultimate idea of a coffee mug. Now, Plato believes there are lots of forms. There are three greatest forms, the true, the good, and the beautiful, that we then measure truth, goodness, and beauty by. These forms, then, for Plato are a matter of objective reasoning and kind of thinking through, how do we know that things are always what they are? Why do we recognize a broken down car and a brand new car and a car whose tires have been stolen as all being cars? Well, because Plato says they have enough resonance with the form that we still recognize that. Now, we can't do theory of forms without talking about the transmigration of the soul, because this is where Plato's view comes into play. Because in the transmigration of the soul, Plato argues that the human soul is actually from this world of the forms, and it descends into the material realm, and it's in this material realm that we are gaining all kinds of. In this material realm, we really forget a lot of what we knew in the realm of the forms. But it's in this material realm then that we see things and we have those flashes like, oh, I know what that is. And throughout life, according to Socrates, we are simply regaining knowledge lost in the transmigration of the forms. And this then is why, for Plato, dialogue is the critical method of doing philosophy. Because no one person has all the knowledge, but actually we all have all the knowledge. Because when we were in the realm of the forms, we had perfect knowledge. But then as that knowledge gets shrunken and forgotten as we are in this material body. But through dialogue, we uncover an awful lot of that knowledge. So through talking with each other, we are uncovering what we already know and what we've forgotten. So that then is Plato's theory of the forms paired with transmigration of the soul, because Plato believes when you die, your soul returns to the world of the forms, and eventually you reincarnate, and you go back, and you go back, and you go back. And it's this endless cycle for Plato. Okay, now I'm going to address term 19, and then we're going to jump to term 18. So in term 19, we're dealing with Plato's Republic. You'll remember this is the book that we read selections from, where the Republic is Plato's attempt to really conduct a massive thought experiment dealing with what is the nature of justice in the political life, and what would a perfect city-state look like. Well, and so the Republic is then set up in 10 books, and it's this massive dialogue. But the whole project of the Republic occurs when Socrates suggests, you know what? We're having trouble explaining justice between one person and another person. What if we expand what we're talking about? What if we try to imagine justice for a whole city? What would a perfectly just, a perfectly correctly arranged city-state look like, where all the parts are perfectly balanced against each other? That is the Republic, and that's the goal. It's one of the earlier utopian schemes put together. And that brings us to term 18. The Republic is ruled over by the guardians in the Republic. The guardians are the ones who establish what caste everyone else gets and make sure the whole system continues to run smoothly. Plato eventually envisioned that there might even arise from amongst the guardians the philosopher king, who would be the greatest king ever because, of course, if he rules in line with philosophy, he will not make any mistakes. We've spent the longest in this video on Plato because he is the foundation for an awful lot of what's coming next. It's a bit of a trite saying, but hopefully you all remember the statement from Alfred North Whitehead, who said that all of philosophy is but a series of footnotes to Plato. Plato introduces he is the beginning point of Western philosophy, and so he merits quite a bit of our attention. But let's turn to one of Plato's students, and that, of course, is Aristotle. And in term 20, we're beginning the terms dealing with Aristotle's philosophy, and that is the Nicomachean Ethics. This is the book that we read from Aristotle. This was written to his son, where he was trying to instruct his son on the ethical life, and it's in the Nicomachean Ethics that we learned three key terms that I want to remind you of. The first of those is term 21. That's arete. Arete can be translated as virtue or excellence. Aristotle reasoned that everything that exists has an excellence, often very closely tied to its telos, or its purpose. The more a thing achieves its excellence, the greater it is, the better it is. So this then gives us a criterion to measure if something is good or not. Is it excellent? Is it the most excellent form of itself? In class, I argued that an unsharpened pencil is less excellent than a finely sharpened pencil. This then is Aristotle's idea of arete. Term 22 is eudaimonia, or happiness. Eudaimonia is Aristotle's concept of happiness, and here we start to get a bit of an answer to the question Plato raised. Where happiness, according to Aristotle, is the greatest possible thing that all men desire, and it has to be self-sustaining. Well, that is going to give Aristotle a way to say that an awful lot of things are not happiness. As for health is not happiness, because health can be taken away from me. My happiness can't consist of wealth, because my ship could sink and my house could burn and my gold could be robbed. In which case, that happiness is not self-sustaining. So if happiness relies on anything else, then it is not ultimately going to be happiness in this sense. So this eudaimonia concept is Aristotle's view of the greatest thing that human beings can achieve. And ultimately, Aristotle is going to tie this eudaimonia to the virtuous life, which means in order to the way to achieve the greatest amount of eudaimonia is then to live by virtues. Well, these virtues then Aristotle arrives at through his principle of the doctrine of the mean. Now, this is a mathematical term. We're talking about the mean, the average between two extremes. Aristotle's ethical method was to identify two different extremes. So, for example, courage and foolhardiness. Cowardliness and foolhardiness, where the coward runs away from danger and the fool runs into danger. Well, Aristotle says that, the virtue of courage is the middle point between those two things. So then living a virtuous life, finding those virtues through this principle of the doctrine of the mean, is the way to have a self-sustaining greatest amount of this greatest thing that all men desire. Because that way, happiness is not tied to wealth. Aristotle thinks it's easier to be happy if you are wealthy, but it's perfectly happy for a poor man to live a virtuous life. It's perfectly possible for a sick man to live a virtuous life. And in doing that, the man is actually achieving his own arete. He is achieving his own excellence. And it is that as he achieves his good, he is said to be happy. Okay. Well, we jump then between terms 23 and 24 on your sheet. There is approximately 900 years. We're moving from Aristotle to St. Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas is a brilliant philosopher who had read every one available to him in his own day, and his writings are filled with those references to what he had read, because part of Thomas's genius was to provide quotes from his opponents. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But it's important in shifting to Aquinas that we keep in mind that Aquinas is ultimately attempting to fuse two things. He believes that fundamentally that all truth is God's truth, and that if Aristotle said things that were true, then it's going to cohere or meld or fit with the truth that the Catholic Church of his day had taught. So Thomas's whole project is to figure out how do we put together Catholic theology and human philosophy and fuse them so that they are both supporting each other as humans are trying to love God and love one another. And in doing that, Thomas developed a new philosophical method. I don't have a clever name for this besides Thomistic method. That's not a very pretty name. Maybe we could call this philosophic debate or something to that nature. But Thomas's method is always the same. He does this throughout the entirety of the Summa Theologica. There is a question at hand that he is seeking to answer. And he begins by giving space to his opponents. And he answers it from his opponent's point of view. And maybe he'll give his opponents 2, 3, 4, 5 answers that he disagrees with. But in doing that, he will articulate their view with as much evidence as he has at his disposal and as charitably as possible. But then, after he gives the objections, he will turn and say, but to the contrary, and then he asserts his own view, and then he gives some reasons why he thinks his view is right, and then he will give responses to however many objections he gave in the first part of his answer. In his introduction to the Summa, Boston College philosopher Peter Kraft argued that Thomas Aquinas is actually the most fair-minded of all the philosophers because no one else ever brings up his opponent's views first. That is unique to Aquinas, and it certainly makes him stand out, as it requires a brilliant mind to step into the other point of view and fairly represent that other point of view, and so on. And Thomas does that consistently throughout all of the Summa. Well, Thomas makes several important arguments that I want to remind you of. And the first of those begins in term 25, man's last end. Now, this is end used in both senses. This is end in the sense of a finish line, and this is the end in terms of a goal. And Thomas brings those together. We are seeking the last end. It's as if we are runners trying to get to that finish line. Well, man's last end for Aquinas is actually a combination. It is ultimately happiness. It's very similar to what Aristotle had to say about happiness, except that Aquinas, as a medieval Catholic and philosopher, believes that ultimately that happiness is going to be found in the knowledge of God. So our happiness is ultimately not divorced from God. Instead, our happiness for Aquinas is actually contingent upon our being in relation to the Creator. So our last end is ultimately to know God and to be known by Him. And that is what ultimately gives us happiness. So this is where I mentioned a moment ago, Aquinas wants to fuse these two traditions. This is one of the places where we see that most clearly. Aquinas uses a ton of Aristotelian reasoning, and then he caps it with Catholic logic, where he says, yes, Aristotle, you were right. Happiness is the greatest thing that men want. It is self-sustaining, and the only thing that is the greatest thing men want and that is really self-sustaining is God Himself. And so when we humans are in connection with God through Jesus Christ, then we are actually in a position to gain, we gain that last end, and we achieve our own excellence. Now, along the way, Aristotle makes several other arguments. So look at term 26. That's free will and its relation to the good for Aquinas. Aquinas may strike you as an overtly Christian philosopher, and he is. We can't get around that, and we shouldn't try to get around that. But he is also the largest proponent of free will that we have studied this year, where Aquinas believes that every human being has the capacity to make a real choice. And throughout our lives, we are either choosing the good and we are choosing to move towards God, or we are choosing something else besides the good and we are moving away from God. This is best symbolized in Dante Alighieri's poetry in the Divine Comedy, particularly in the Canto of the Inferno, where we arrive at the gateway to hell. Because the gateway to hell begins with that famous line, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." But it continues to explain that the creation of hell was a mercy of God. I don't know if you ever thought about the idea of hell as a mercy, but here's the logic that Dante gives, and he borrows this straight from Aquinas, that people throughout their lives choose to live in certain ways. They choose these sins that ultimately damn them for all eternity. Well, God creates hell so that they will continue to have the thing that they have chosen. If they have spent all of their lives running away from God and intentionally rejecting Him, Dante posits that it would be unfair for them to then spend eternity in God's presence. That really hell then is the creation of God, letting people have what they want. There's one of my favorite lines in C.S. Lewis is when Lewis, in the Chronicles of Narnia, Lewis has Aslan turn and explain to the kids that all men get what they truly want. I think this is something close to what Lewis is referring to. What we truly want leads us to our choices. And Aquinas is arguing here that God gives us what we truly want. If we truly want sin and we truly hate God, God will respect our choices. If we truly want God and we choose to move towards God, God then respects our choices. So for Aquinas, or studying Aquinas should hopefully remind us that we as human creatures have this incredible capacity for free will, and our choices truly do matter. Well, along the way, Aquinas gives what his most famous passage is called the 5 Proofs for the Existence of God. And Aquinas plays the role of evangelical proof quite fairly. He limits himself. He's not quoting the Bible to prove God's existence. Instead, he is leaning purely on philosophical reasoning. Just with philosophy can we prove God's existence. Well, Aquinas says yes, and he has 5 different ways. One of those ones that we looked at was bringing forth an argument from Aristotle. It's Aristotle's prime mover argument, where Aristotle argued that all things are in motion, but nothing is in motion unless it is being propelled by some outside force. So Aristotle then reasons that there must be an ultimate unmoved mover that is itself the motive force for the universe. Now Aristotle says that this is a force that he calls God. That is not a person, that is just a logically necessary force. But Aristotle says we must have this prime mover. Aquinas comes along, and Aquinas says, yeah, that is that prime mover, but we call that prime mover God, and God is he is that person who is the mover of the universe. So, in term 28, I'm asking you a question: what makes human beings unique? We've got two different things here. That really there is our rationality and there is our free will, which combine together to make us the only creatures in all of the creation who can choose to rationally love God. Lots of animals and plants, Aquinas argues, naturally love God. Because they have that they just by virtue of being what they are filled with love for their Creator. We human beings are different. We have the ability to go beyond that, and we can actually choose to love God. And that's what makes us different. And we can choose to contemplate God, and in contemplating His essence, we actually grow in our understanding, and we grow in our love for God, which is quite different than, of course, any other thing in existence. All right. All of that we have covered now, ancient and medieval philosophy. Even though we are only on term 29, we are, in terms of time, halfway through our philosophy review. So, in term 29, I ask you to summarize the goal of ancient and medieval philosophy, and I would put it this way, that ancient and medieval philosophy both begin in wonder. They begin in wonder. Philosophy begins in wonder, being astounded at the world, amazed at how beautiful and marvelous and intricate reality is, and trying to explain how marvelous this world is. So it really is, we're dealing with wonder, we're dealing with explanation, and we're also dealing there with trying to figure out wisdom which can guide our best living in the world. Modern philosophy is profoundly different. Modern philosophy, to answer term 30 and summarizing the goal here, modern philosophy begins in doubt. And modern philosophy begins with the assumption that we have been fooled and we should not be fooled. And if we think carefully enough, we can avoid being fooled by anyone. Now, please notice those are two profoundly different orientations to the world, to thinking, and to life in general. So, let's move on then to term 31. We are now in the beginnings of modern philosophy with René Descartes and his meditations on first principles. So, now, these terms are going to be a little out of order, but I think it'll be okay. So, term 31 is Cartesian doubt. This refers to the principle of doubting everything which can be doubted so that you find that which cannot be doubted, and from that touchstone, that foundation, Descartes believes we can find out what is really, really true. So that position of Cartesian doubt is the fundamental difference between our previous philosophers and our modern philosophers. If you remember, Aquinas talked about the senses as the 5 windows to the soul. They are the light through which reality pours information into the soul. Well, Descartes is going to begin with doubting his senses. Now, Aquinas does not prove that the senses are that. He assumes that. He says the senses, we're going to take the senses as foundational, and we're going to then build from there. Descartes begins at doubting the senses. Now, in term 32, we get Descartes' most famous line, cogito ergo sum, where this is looking at the idea that where Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. This becomes Descartes' touchstone point. If he thinks, then he must exist, because he otherwise could not be thinking. So he has proven his own existence, but unfortunately, he's not proven much else, and we'll get to that in the next few terms. Term 33 is looking at the book that we read. We read Descartes' Meditations. It's in 5 parts, and we did read all of those. It's in Descartes' Meditations that Descartes begins establishing what is called Cartesian dualism. Now, this is getting back to an anthropology debate about what are human beings made of. And for Descartes, we have 2 parts. We have the body and we have the mind. Now, at the same time, Descartes is a good Catholic, but he does not affirm he doesn't really deal with the soul in this book. Instead, he sets up the idea that we are these 2 parts, and they are separated, leading to term 35, the mind-body problem. How exactly is our mind connected to our bodies? The short answer is we don't really know. Now, there's one sense in which this is really obvious. We do know for sure there's some connection between the brain, the material, the brain matter, and your selfhood, your mind, your conception of yourself. There have been a variety of neurological studies and neurological accidents that have proven there's some connection there, but we can't say for certain. Because we can point to all the physical things, but those physical things are not the mind. The mind is immaterial. The mind is your conception of yourself and your ability to think. We don't know precisely where those are. So the mind-body problem is a philosophical discussion looking at questions like, could we separate the mind and the body? Could we download the mind into a robot or upload the mind into the cloud? All kinds of questions like that are assuming a fundamental divisibility between these two. Descartes is the beginning of the mind, Descartes is our modern beginning of that particular problem. Now, Descartes accidentally leads to term 36, which is solipsism, where solipsism is the philosophical idea that the thinker is the only one who exists. Everyone else is a figment of the thinker's imagination. So, since I am watching this video, since I am making this video and you are watching it, I am a figment of your imagination under the idea of solipsism. So, you have just imagined all the information in this video and projected into this form, and you are imagining everything that is. Now, I want to be clear, Descartes is not really a solipsist, but if you follow his logic consistently, he brings you directly to that point. Which brings us to term 37, epistemic doubt. So epistemic doubt is looking at you notice the connection to the word epistemology here, but we're looking at doubt of what is known. Now Descartes then begins with this as his assumption. This term is rather similar to Cartesian doubt, but here we're looking at the fact that I don't know if I can trust what I know. If my senses have been deceived, then I don't know that I can trust that I'm actually holding a coffee mug or drinking now lukewarm coffee. I don't know that, perhaps, and I should doubt that. I should doubt my knowledge, and I should doubt the sources of my knowledge, since I don't know them with certainty. Well, Descartes then posits term 38, that's the evil genius. He comes up with the idea that maybe I'm being deceived, but I'm being deceived by someone. Can't be God, because Descartes rejects the idea that God could deceive us. So there must be some being that is far more powerful than any of us, and he calls that being the evil genius. The evil genius is the sneaky guy who is out trying to convince us, who's fooling us in all these many, many ways. Well, by the end of his book, Descartes has written a lot of things about God, about triangles, and about man, and then ultimately he concludes that man is a thinking thing. And this is what I wanted to end with on Descartes, because this is really where Descartes gives us a particular vision of what it means to be human. For Descartes, we don't have wonder, we don't have appreciation, we don't have gratitude at the heart of what it means to be human. Instead, we have the ability to think. Cognitive reason is the core of what it means to be human, which gives rise to all kinds of really awful things later on in the 19th and 20th centuries, because who defines what it means to think? Who decides that you think at a level worthy of being a thinking thing? This becomes a definition which can give rise to atrocity very, very easily. Because if you think on one level and then someone else thinks on a different level, well, I can go through and decide, well, you are a thinking thing, but that other person is not. And if he's not a thinking thing, then he's not human, so I can kill him without any moral problems. This kind of thinking leads to the dehumanization of those who have abnormal psychology. So if you have someone who has an abnormal psychological disposition, well, if they don't fit the thinking thing idea, then they are not human, according to Descartes' reasoning. Well, that finishes René Descartes, and I'm sure you all remember, because I don't think I can do 10 minutes on Descartes with a straight face, that I really do not like Descartes. But let's move on to someone else who is more confusing and possibly more disturbing. And that is, of course, Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume wrote his treatise on human nature, and this is where Hume really comes up with his philosophical system, which is term 41, that is skepticism. So skepticism here is the idea that we know nothing for sure. Descartes had at least one, maybe three things he knows for sure. By the end of the Meditations, of course, it's God, triangles, and his own existence. But Hume does not accept that. Hume takes Descartes and goes a step further and says, how do you know that you are, in fact, that thinking thing? Can you really know that? Hume says no. That's going to mark Hume out as a skeptic, and Hume is going to be a supreme logical reasoner and of ultimately reaching the realm of skepticism. Now, it was in this context that we talked about two other philosophical terms, terms 42 and 43, empiricism and rationalism, where empiricism is looking at the idea that things are true if they can be empirically verified. So, scientifically measured, tested, the physical things, those are what we can empirically know with certainty. Rationalism, instead, agrees with a lot of what empiricism says, but says, no, you also can trust like a chain of real reasoning. And now I gave you guys the official Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy definitions of those terms in the notes. I wanted to briefly remind you how that works. So, on to term 44. How, according to Hume, do we get our ideas? Well, Hume says that we get our ideas through impressions. Every idea comes through the senses into the mind, where the mind makes a copy of that idea, and that copy we call an impression. That's term 45. Now, the mind then groups these copies together by their resemblances. That's term 46. Now, the trick here with these is that these resemblances aren't real. They are just happenstances. It's as if I decided one day completely arbitrarily in class to group together all students wearing red shirts, and all students wearing yellow shirts, and all students wearing blue shirts. And then I come back and say, all you guys wearing red shirts, you are now collectively the student I'm going to name Red. And all you people wearing green are collectively the student I'm going to name Green. And you're not actually individual people, you're just grouped together. Hume believes that all of our ideas actually work that way, including our ideas about ourselves. So by the end of his philosophical system, Hume has rejected the idea of cause and effect, and he's rejected the idea that there is, in fact, an I to be thinking in Descartes, to borrow Descartes' logic. So Hume then believes that no, he doesn't really exist as himself, but he thinks he does, because of course these resemblances are quite persuasive. But really, the whole goal of his philosophy is to undo these assumptions. Now, I don't want to move on to this without covering the fact that Hume did not himself consistently practice his own philosophy. He tells us in one of his journals that he could only believe his philosophy to be true as long as he is sitting alone in his study. As soon as he goes out to the marketplace, reality imposes itself upon him. So Hume, I would argue, Hume's skepticism is proven false by virtue of human experience and the fact that he could not himself live by his own philosophy. Well, you'll remember from Hume, we then went into a different direction and we spent a few weeks on utilitarian ethics. That's term 47. A utilitarian ethics is a system of right and wrong governed by the principle of the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. And if we achieve the greatest good for the greatest amount of people, then that's a good action. And that principle is what should guide our ethical considerations. Well, in terms of, as we were exploring that, we needed to talk about two larger umbrella terms in ethics. And I want to remind you how those work. If you look at term 48, deontological ethics, and term 49, consequentialist ethics, You'll notice, hopefully, those two are, neither of those are themselves specific ethical systems. They are categories of ethical systems. Deontological ethics names a bunch of ethical systems that are duty-based ethics. They assert that you have a duty that you must fulfill, and therefore you have an obligation to do an action. Consequentialist ethics aren't concerned with duty as much. Instead, consequentialist ethics are looking at the consequences that will come out of an ethical choice. So these two then become the main frameworks through which we looked at ethics from this point onward. Now, take a look at term 50, because this was our the only term from Bentham I have on here. But Jeremy Bentham's hedonic calculus is an important one. Bentham was the first utilitarian, and he argued that really the way you could determine the greatest good for the greatest number was to assign a mathematical value to all of the outcomes that you can foresee. And that then you can calculate the mathematical value of the choice. So, for example, if I was trying to determine, should I cheat on the final exam? I could think about that, well, like, okay, so it's, all right, if I cheat, well, that's easier than studying, so that's maybe +1. And if I don't get caught, then maybe I can get an A on the exam and raise my overall grade. We'll say that's +2. So really, cheating on the final exam gets me a positive value of 3. But then Bentham would say we need to reverse the calculation and say, well, what about the negative outcomes? Well, let's see. If I cheat, I don't really know the material. That's a -2. And if I get caught, then I get a 0 on the exam. That's -3. And then I could get suspended from school, and my teacher won't write me a letter of recommendation for college in next year. Well, now all of a sudden I'm looking at -8 or -9, and clearly by utilitarian methods I should opt not to cheat because the consequences are worse than the benefit. That's Bentham's hedonic calculus method. Now Bentham really came up with, he's the beginning of utilitarianism, but it really comes into its own with John Stuart Mills. John Stuart Mills was a thinker, philosopher, and lawyer who wrote his book on his essay called Utilitarianism that really made this more of a mainstream approach. And for John Stuart Mills, the core idea is in term 51, and that's utility. And by utility, Mills means that which causes the greatest pleasure for the greatest number with the least amount of pain involved. So he's then looking for the idea then that Mills thinks this is really how people reason. That this is really, he doesn't think he's coming up with a new system. He believes he's simply naming the way people really operate. People, according to Mills, don't really operate in this whole virtue system that Aristotle is thinking of. Instead, people think about, okay, I want to do X. Will it hurt me? Will it hurt others? If not, then I will totally do X. Now, do notice that for this kind of consideration, there's not really an external comparison. I'm not asking, is the action good? Is the action right? Instead, I'm asking, is the action hurtful? Because that ties into Mills' view on happiness, which is term 52. As Mills believed that happiness is synonymous with pleasure. Mills doesn't subscribe to either Aristotle or Aquinas' lofty philosophical view of happiness, where happiness ultimately is a supreme good that is beyond all other things. For Mills, happiness is that feeling you have when you've worked out and the endorphins are rushing and you feel good. It's the satisfaction of winning a prize. It's the feeling of getting what you want. It's the pleasure of perhaps eating an entire jar of M&Ms and just feeling super satisfied with your M&Ms. It's all of this pleasure that Mills believes is happiness, and really, ultimately, for Mills, that's the goal. The goal is to have more happiness and less pain for more people, and if we achieve that goal, then society is moving in a good direction. Okay. Well, that's John Stuart Mills. Let's shift in term 53 to your favorite complicated German and mine, Immanuel Kant. So, Immanuel Kant in term 53, the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals.